I understand the frustration behind the Arizona law. We have been advocating immigration reform here at Cato pretty much since I got here 13 years ago. The difference is I want to expand opportunities for legal immigration. While I believe Mark and a lot of other restrictionists don't care that much for legal immigration either and want to constrict that as well. And whether the Arizona law is constitutional or not, that's not my area. But I believe it is bad public policy. The law is an exercise in empty symbolism. It has already proven to be polarizing, and I predict it's going to do virtually nothing to reduce illegal immigration in the United States. It might chase those immigrants to other states or push them further underground. This new law won't lower the crime rate in Arizona. It's not going to build any new houses. It's not going to boost the economy in Arizona. It is not going to create a single job, except maybe for lawyers and police officers. In fact, the new law will probably do just the opposite. It may lead to higher crime, unemployment, and make the housing slump even worse than it would be without the law. Now, one of the clinching arguments behind passage of SB 1070 in Arizona was the fear of crime and this belief that illegal immigration has fueled a crime wave in Arizona, and this law is going to save the citizens of the state from it. Yet all the data point in the opposite direction. Violent crime in Phoenix last year plunged 17% from the year before. That's a decline 3 times greater than the nationwide decline in crime. According to the Phoenix Police Department, that downward trend has continued into 2010, despite what we hear on cable TV and talk radio. The first 3 months of 2010, homicides were down 38% in Phoenix, robbery 27%. Arizona's other major cities reported similar drops in crime. Kidnappings are also down. This is a strange kind of crime. The statistics are a little shadowy on this. It appears to be the kind of crime, an inside crime affecting primarily drug traffickers and gang members, not the average Arizona citizen. Despite the popular fears, the crime rate in Arizona is the lowest it has been in 40 years. As I believe Tim will make clear, that the new law may actually make it more difficult for law enforcement officers in Arizona to combat real crime. Now, the new law will do nothing to stimulate Arizona's economy or create jobs either. Low-skilled immigrants, legal and illegal, provided the necessary manpower that fueled Arizona's growth before the recent recession. There's no connection between unemployment and immigration. In fact, just the opposite. In the 1990s in Arizona, as illegal immigration more than tripled, the unemployment rate dropped from 5 to 4%. From 2000 to 2007, the illegal population grew by another 200,000, and the unemployment rate dropped further to 3.9%. Since the recession began, the illegal population in Arizona has dropped by 100,000, and yet the unemployment rate has more than doubled to 9%. The new law is already taking a toll on Arizona's economy by scaring away tourists and convention business. And when the state's economy begins to recover, the law will make it harder for Arizona companies to hire the workers they need to build new houses, harvest crops, and serve customers in retail and food service. Low-skilled immigrants do impose additional costs on state and local governments. I think that's established. I don't deny that. But the critics exaggerate those costs, and they ignore the much greater economic benefits from allowing more legal immigrants to enter the country, including low-skilled immigrants. Last year, Cato published a study by economists Peter Dixon and Maureen Rimmer that found that a robust temporary worker program and legalization program, after 10 years, would increase the household incomes of American households by $180 billion a year. That general finding was confirmed by another study done by the Center for American Progress earlier this year. The biggest gain comes from something called the occupation mix effect. Low-skilled immigrants actually allow Americans to do more of what we're best at. They free us up to move up to jobs that are more productive and better paying, increasing our income. It also raises the productivity of legalized workers, allowing them to produce more goods and services for the money that we pay them, and we realize the benefits. It allows us to capture money that's now wasted in smuggling fees to be consumed in the domestic economy or collected by the government in terms of taxes and fees. It stimulates more investment, which also creates more revenue for the government. Constricting, and in contrast, constricting the inflow of low-skilled immigrants exacts a cost on American households. According to our study, about $80 billion a year would be lost to American households in income if we reduced the presence of low-skilled immigrants by 30%. Now, you just do the math. The difference between getting immigration policy right and getting it wrong is about $250 billion. Now, last time I checked, that's still real money, even here in Washington. The answer to illegal immigration is not to criminalize honest work, but to change our immigration system to meet the labor needs of a dynamic market economy. To solve the illegal immigration problem, first we have to understand why these low-skilled immigrants come here, legally or illegally. And like a lot of things, it's a story of demand and supply. Low-skilled illegal immigrants come here because there are jobs. In a typical year of normal growth in Arizona and across the country, we're creating hundreds of thousands of net new jobs in low-skilled categories: food processing, landscaping, retailing, all those jobs. And meanwhile, the number of Americans who have traditionally filled those jobs continues to shrink. We're talking about adult Americans without a high school diploma. Believe it or not, if you went back to the early 1960s, half of adult Americans in the workforce did not have high school diplomas. They were satisfied with these sorts of jobs as a career job. Not today. That number is well below 10% and dropping. In fact, the number of adults in the workforce without a high school diploma has dropped by 3 million in the last decade. It's going to drop by another 2 or 3 million over the next decade. So you have this structural gap on the low end of the labor market, and immigrants fill that gap. Now, the problem is there's no legal channel for a sufficient number of low-skilled immigrants to come in and fill those jobs, and the result is widespread illegal immigration. We have tried a policy of enforcement only, and it's failed. If you go back to 1992, since 1992, we have increased funding on border enforcement by 700%. We've increased the number of agents, Border Patrol agents on the southwest border five-fold, from 3,500 to 17,000. We built hundreds of miles of fence along the border, much of it across private property. Yet the number of illegal immigrants in the United States has tripled over that time. And I say to my conservative friends, imagine a federal education program where we've had that sort of dramatic increase in funding and personnel, and yet the problem hasn't gotten better, it's gotten worse. The only answer is comprehensive immigration reform. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano, former governor of Arizona, has talked recently about a three-legged stool for immigration reform, and if any one of the legs are missing, it doesn't stand up. A temporary visa program to accommodate future labor needs of the country, legalizing those who are already here. We're not talking amnesty. We're talking fines, back taxes, security checks, getting in line with everybody else if you want permanent status, and then smart enforcement for those people who still insist on operating outside the system. You know, in 1986, we passed something called immigration reform, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It had two of the legs, right? It had an amnesty, and it had increased enforcement, but it made no provision for future flows. Here we are, more than 20 years later, wrestling with the same problem. Everybody agrees that was a failure. Let's not make that mistake again. And we know from experience that if you give a legal alternative to low-skilled immigrants, they'll take it. In the early 1950s, we were apprehending 1 million, mostly Mexican, illegal immigrants at the border a year. Congress did two things. They increased enforcement, but they also dramatically increased the number of visas available through the Bracero program. Illegal immigration, or at least apprehensions at the border, which is a good proxy, dropped by 95%. When that program was repealed in 1964, illegal immigration began to rise inexorably, and here we are today. Now, critics say we must get control of the border first before we can enact comprehensive immigration reform. Well, first, we probably already have the most control over the border than perhaps we've had in American history because of the resources we've poured into it. But secondly, it makes no logical sense to insist that a flawed and unenforceable law be fully enforced before we consider changing the law. It's like in 1932 arguing that we can't change prohibition until we crack down on every moonshiner and bootlegger out there. We need to get control of the illegal liquor industry before we repeal prohibition. No, repealing prohibition allowed us to get control of the alcohol industry. It brought it above ground so that we could regulate and tax it. And I think the same would be true of the underground labor market. Now, in conclusion, I'm in a magnanimous mood. I will also concede that we could get control of the borders and reduce illegal immigration through enforcement only. But at what cost? How many billions more do we need to spend? How many more agents do we need to station at the border? How many more factories and kitchens do we need to raid with guns drawn? How many more miles of ugly fence do we need to build along the Rio Grande and along our border, much of it across private property? And how many more liberties do American citizens need to surrender in the form of national ID cards, e-verify programs, all in the dubious cause of enforcing a law that is fundamentally out of step with the needs and the values of our great nation? There is a better way. We need to change our immigration law so that it reflects the needs of our economy and the choices made by millions of Americans and immigrants in the labor market every day. Comprehensive immigration reform, including a robust temporary worker program, is the key to securing our borders, safeguarding our liberties, and expanding the economy to create better paying jobs for middle-class Americans. And I believe it's doable. There's an opportunity, probably not this year. I think the chances don't exist this year, but perhaps next year for both parties to work together to solve this vexing national problem. Don't take this personally, Mark, but the Republican leaders need to liberate themselves from the Lou Dobbs minority within the conservative Republican movement who oppose any kind of liberalization of immigration. Democratic leaders need to face down their labor union constituency who are opposed to any guest worker programs or temporary worker programs. I'm doubtful anything can be accomplished between now and November, but I think next year President Obama and a new Congress and a bipartisan majority will have another opportunity to reform our immigration system and finally fix this problem of illegal immigration. Thank you very much.